I've got to cover in this lecture approximately 10,000 years of human history, so we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I don't want to lose any time on this. Just to remind you where we were in this series, the lecture last time set out some general parameters of this project of mine and really did human prehistory before there was any recorded evidence of how political societies evolved. And we left off at the stage of development of tribal societies, or those based on descent groups. And if you recall, the tribal form of organization is not the most primitive. You have band and family level organization before you get to these large tribal units, but approximately 10,000 years ago, with the development of agriculture, you began to organize societies by segmentary lineages. All right, so that was the last bit. So today we're actually going to cover the origins of the state, which is the first of these three big categories of political institutions that I'm dealing with. And we're going to talk about where states came from, and then in specific cases of China and India, what we historically know about the formation of states there. Actually, in this section, I've also got several chapters on the Middle East and on Europe. The basic problem is, how do you exit out of a kinship-based society into something involving genuine hierarchical, impersonal political institutions? So, you know, I'm just going to start, and I'll see how far I can get in the time I've got allotted. I suspect I'm not going to make it all the way through all four of these different civilizations, but I certainly want to do the China-India parts. All right, so let's just begin with a kind of abstract summary of what a state is compared to a tribal society. I think there's at least 5 characteristics. States, unlike tribes, possess a centralized hierarchical source of authority that is, at least in theory, capable of enforcing rules. Second, that authority is backed by a monopoly of power, legitimate power, which means that the state can actually coerce you into obeying its rules. And the legitimacy part is important. So there are no militias, and there's a general social consensus that the state has the right to exert that power. The third characteristic, states are territorial. Clovis called himself the king of the Franks, but he did not rule over a state, whereas Louis XIV was the king of France, not of a group of people, but of an actual territory. And one was a tribal society, and the other was a state. Fourth characteristic, states are much more stratified and hierarchical. And in fact, there's a certain tragedy in human history as you pass from a tribal society that is relatively egalitarian, that chooses its leaders on the basis of a certain kind of consensus and participation. When you move into the era of states, you have the development of things like slavery, absolute powerlessness in the face of these centralized institutions, and you get the first emergence of genuine social classes. And then final characteristic, although you have ancestor worship and other fairly primitive forms of religion in tribal societies, it becomes much more institutionalized once you move to a state level. So even if you stick with ancestor worship, you usually have a specialized class, priestly class, that is the custodian of religious belief. Now, you may have noticed, those of you that have taken comparative national systems or other courses from me may have noticed that the definition that I just gave you very much corresponds to Max Weber's famous definition of the state. I like using it simply because it's useful. It distinguishes state level organizations from corporations, NGOs, political parties, other kinds of forms of social organization. But it's important to realize that not every society around the world actually generated on its own a state-level form of organization. The societies in Melanesia that I mentioned in the first lecture were stateless prior to the arrival of the European colonialists. In Africa, prior to the big surge of European colonialism in the late 19th century, approximately half of Africa was organized into acephalous societies or stateless societies. And so one of the things we want to try to understand today is, why is it that you get the early evolution of this state structure in certain parts of the world and not in others. Anthropologists distinguish between pristine and competitive state formation. Pristine state formation is the first time a state ever appeared out of a tribal society, whereas competitive state formation is what we're used to seeing all over the place, which is that somebody else invents the state, and all of a sudden you've got to get a state too, because the state is such a powerful form of organization that if you don't organize yourself as a state, you're simply going to get killed by the troops that your rival state deploys. Now, there's one problem with pristine state formation, which is that no one's ever seen this happen because it all happened in human prehistory, and there are no actual records of a state, the first state ever emerging out of a tribal society. But that has not stopped anthropologists and archaeologists from speculating like crazy about where states came from. And so I'm going to go over some of the theories and then see how those correspond to the actual experience in China and India. One point I would like to make, however, is that it is, I think, a general truth about development as a whole that no earlier form of social organization ever gets truly abandoned or eliminated, and it always survives into the succeeding higher level of organization. So in India and China, for example, lineage organization exists to this day. It was never abolished. And in a certain sense, if you understand patrimonial government to be recruitment into the public sector that is based on kinship or on personal ties rather than some more impersonal kind of criteria, then patrimonialism and the desire to appropriate public office for yourself and very particularly for your family's benefit, remains an absolutely central human drive. If you recall, I mentioned last week William Hamilton's theory of inclusive fitness that posits that altruism is in proportion to the number of shared genes, and I think one of the truths about politics is that human beings are not actually individually selfish. They are selfish on behalf of families. And one of the constants in human politics has been the drive to repatrimonialize state institutions and appropriate them for your family. As we'll see in the final lecture on Europe, in 17th century France, this emerged as the actual sale of public offices and the conversion of public office into actual heritable private property. And so this is this natural instinct to protect your family has been pretty much a constant throughout and has not disappeared, needless to say, in modern politics. All right, so let me go over quickly the different theories of pristine state formation. First theory is that of Thomas Hobbes, that it's a social contract and that it's the result of a kind of rational process of negotiation. I don't know that Hobbes actually believed that this is how the first states came about, but it's certainly a model that he puts forward in the Leviathan. I think that if you think about this commonsensically, it's hard to imagine a state-level organization actually proceeding as a result of a rational negotiation among tribal segments, because what you're doing is essentially delegating. You're a tribal chief or a member of a tribe, and you're delegating this terrible authority to essentially control you and your tribe, not just in the present moment, but all of the descendants of that leader of the new state will be able to control you and your tribal segment. And it is extremely hard to imagine circumstances in which you're simply motivated, let's say by economic motives, where you would give up the kind of freedom in the relatively egalitarian status that people in tribal societies enjoy. And so, again, we've never seen a contractually organized state form, and I suspect that this was probably not the major route by which this happened. Second theory is a version of this, actually, that was promoted by Karl Wittfogel, this hydraulic theory of state formation. Wittfogel was a former communist who then turned into an anti-communist and settled in the United States and wrote a book called Oriental Despotism, in which he argued that states really formed out of big water projects, big irrigation projects, because according to him there's a correlation between large-scale irrigation and the emergence of early states in Mesopotamia, in the Valley of Mexico, in China, in the Nile Valley, and so forth. And again, unfortunately, although this is one of those things that academics debated at some length, there's just no empirical evidence that this was the case. There was this correlation, but most early irrigation projects were actually very small scale that could be easily managed by much lower levels of social organization. And again, you just think about what this negotiation would have been like to form the first state if the motive was irrigation. You have all these tribesmen sitting around saying, well, let's delegate to this great water engineer this dictatorial control over us and all of our descendants, because although we've never actually seen one of these water projects actually produce anything, we trust that he knows what he's doing and will be able to create this big irrigation system, and all of us will be rich for the future. And it just doesn't make sense that this should have happened. And I think very few scholars actually believe Wittfogel right now. A third general theory is associated with Esther Boserup and demographers in her school, which says that you need population density to create a state, because that's the condition under which you get a division of labor, when you get specialization, and in fact you don't really see states emerge until a couple thousand years after the invention of agriculture that then permits population densities to rise, especially in alluvial river valleys like Egypt or Mesopotamia or the Yellow River Valley in China. And, you know, that's all right as a theory, but again, many tribally organized societies respond to greater density and to attempts to control them simply by moving away. And it's not absolutely clear why simple density in itself should automatically lead to the emergence of a completely new kind of social organization that, again, no one had ever seen in history. So this brings us then to slightly tougher theories that states emerged out of violence. And here, and again, we can appeal back to Hobbes, because obviously in Hobbes's theory of the Leviathan, it's really the war of every man against every man that drives people to give up their freedom. And this one, I think you can plausibly imagine. You get tribal groups, let's say like all the militias that are fighting out, duking it out with each other in present-day Somalia, and they go on for a generation or so, killing each other, and they finally get tired of it. And at that point, you know, they'd be perfectly willing to say, okay, we're going to delegate authority to this Leviathan, to a king or, you know, leader. We will give up our freedom to kill each other because we don't want to die ourselves. And so the Hobbesian bargain is correct if it's a bargain over violence, but it's not correct if it's simply a bargain over economic goods. Again, this is not a sufficient, I think, explanation. Those highland tribes in Papua New Guinea that I described have been fighting each other at a very high level of violence measured in terms of casualty or the number of years they spend in warfare, and yet never developed a state-level society. So I think you need something more, which brings us to the fifth theory that is associated with the anthropologist Robert Carnero, that says that it is a combination both of scale and circumscription. That is to say, you can't have a state unless you have a fairly large open area in which you can essentially move armies and coerce people. But if that open area is not bounded by physical barriers to movement, then people will simply respond to coercion by running away. And this is one of the big problems with slavery, is that if you don't have sufficient ways of keeping slaves penned up in a certain area, it is extremely difficult to initiate that form of exploitation. And this is why Carnero argues that you had states appear in places like Mesopotamia, the Yellow River Valley, and the Nile, especially the Nile River Valley. It's not just that these were agriculturally rich, but they were also circumscribed, and it was not simply possible for all of the tribal units to run away from the authority of this newly formed hierarchical organization. And actually there's some evidence coming out of a lot of the Pacific islands, that in Melanesia you don't have states, but in Fiji, Tonga, Hawaii, you actually did get the emergence of chiefdoms and kingdoms. And there is a correlation between scale and obviously every island is by definition circumscribed, so they're all circumscribed, but there is a certain correlation between physical characteristics that allow kings essentially to generate substantial military force, and then their ability to impose their will on the population. And the problem with Papua New Guinea or the Solomons is that everybody lives in these extremely rugged, cut-up mountain valleys, and it was never possible under those circumstances to generate the sufficient kind of military organization necessary to create a state. Final issue is one that archaeologists don't help us with very much because there's no archaeological or very uncertain archaeological record, which is religion or charismatic authority. Weber said that charismatic authority means being touched by God. Virtually every state-level leader in history has claimed some kind of transcendental divine authority. I think the clearest example of this is the rise of the Prophet Muhammad in the early 7th century. If you look at the Arab tribes in the Arabian Peninsula, they had been around for at least a millennium before the rise of the Prophet Muhammad. They were an utterly peripheral social group, sandwiched between Europe and the Byzantine Empire and other state-level formations like Persia that existed at the time. And all of a sudden, with the rise of the Prophet Muhammad and this new religion of Islam, you had this enormous mobilization of tribesmen that was able to overcome the intrinsic divisions of a tribal society. The Arab tribes had never been able to work collectively for a common purpose until Islam gave them a different kind of identity. And if you look at the doctrine of Islam and you read a lot of the early words of the Prophet Muhammad, it's clearly aimed at tribalism, that the ummah of believers is not based on genealogy. And in fact, there's a constant struggle against tribal identity in early Arab societies, and without that religious ideology that justified non-kinsmen working together, you never would have had this explosion of political power bursting out of the Arabian desert and then going on within a single generation to conquer the Persian Empire, to threaten Byzantium, to conquer the entire Maghreb all the way up through Spain. Now, as we'll see, the tribalism in Arab society never disappeared, and the problems still remain despite the ability to unify those tribes for the purposes of conquest. And it turned out that tribal societies were not terribly good at actually ruling and governing over an extended period of time, and it required another institution in order to create durable societies in the Muslim world. So what we conclude about pristine state formation, the actual conditions are probably some combination of all of those above factors. Unfortunately, this doesn't lead you to a very elegant theory, and it begins to look a little bit more like a just so story, but it does seem to me that the conditions under which states form are sufficiently complex that it's probably hard to have a very elegant theory. Jeffrey Herbst has a very nice account of why there are so few states in sub-Saharan Africa that builds on a lot of the elements that I mentioned, which is to say low population density, lack of circumscription, physical circumscription, again, apart from the Nile Valley, which is where you actually did get a state in Africa, very difficult communications through the wooded and jungle parts of Africa, which make it very hard to project political power and the like. One issue that I want to return to is again what I call the Hobbesian fallacy, which is the idea that any particular form of political organization solves the problem of violence. And I think you see with state formation, it solves the problem of intertribal violence by creating a single source of authority, wiping out competing militias or other armed groups and imposing the will of the state, but it does not solve the human problem of violence because it simply moves it up to a different scale. So now instead of tribal segments fighting each other, now you get states fighting each other. Okay, so that's the speculative part that comes out of from the anthropologists and archaeologists. So now we need to move on to what we know about historical state formation, and we're going to begin not with Mesopotamia, Egypt. I mean, you know, I just couldn't cover everything, but I do think that there's a justification for beginning with China because temporally, states formed in China at a very early period, but I would argue that modern states formed in China. China was really the first society in the world to create a genuinely modern state, and they actually did this already by the 3rd century BC, which puts them about 1,800 years ahead of any European society. And the level of sophistication of the Chinese state in the 3rd century BC was at that time much more sophisticated than anything that any of the Greek city-states were able to produce, or the Roman Republic, which was also getting its start at that time. Now, just to give you a little bit of a preview, the Chinese were precocious in creating a modern state, but they did not create the other two legs of what I regard as a modern political system, which is to say rule of law or accountable government. And so to say that the Chinese achieved a modern state in a certain sense is to say that what they figured out is how to create a more perfect dictatorship at a very early period in history, because state building concentrates power and allows states to use that power against individuals. The rule of law and accountable government are restrictions on the power of states that limit their ability to use them. And if you have a modern, well-organized bureaucratic state is capable of a far greater degree of tyranny over its subjects than is a poorly organized, corrupt, weak one. And I think that, in a sense, has been the dilemma in Chinese politics right from the beginning. And as we will see, the Indian path of development could not be more different, because I believe that India really had something that resembled the rule of law. It didn't really have political accountability, but it had institutions that prevented centralized states from deploying their power. So this will be the kind of larger framework in which we'll talk about these two societies. Now, if you look at the actual historical record, there's a famous thesis by Charles Tilly about European state building where, to summarize it, he says, the state made war and war made the state. That is to say that the fundamental driver of European state formation, particularly in the early modern period, was the need to mobilize for military conflict. The need to mobilize created the need for resources, which created the need to tax. The need to tax created the need for a bureaucracy to extract those taxes, and the need to create the bureaucracy then led to the rational organization of the government as a whole to employ those resources rationally. And this is exactly the historical pattern that you see unfold in China, except that it unfolds in China at a much, much earlier historical period. There are other alternative approaches to the Chinese one, and some of them are not necessarily driven by war, but again, this is one of those sad facts, I think, of this larger scale human history, which is that the good things, development, political development and modernization, are driven by the bad things, namely the need to compete and the need to organize for military conflict. All right, so let's turn to China itself. I'm only going to deal with China up until the beginning of the Han Dynasty, which was the second dynasty of a unified China. So we're going to leave the story off even before the birth of Christ. Chinese history is extremely complicated and extremely well documented. This chart simply carries you up until the emergence of the Qin dynasty, which was the first unified dynasty in China. Human beings have been living in this part of the world for a very, very long time. The earliest remain, there are in fact some archaic human beings that got to this area before the emigration out of Africa. The Yangshao and Longshan periods are not dynasties. These are simply archaeological periods, and we only know about them from various kinds of excavations. What the Chinese regard as the beginning of their historical period begins with the so-called three dynasties, which is actually the Jia, Shang, and then the Zhou dynasty, which was divided into two parts. And confusingly enough, the Eastern Zhou dynasty, which was the second half of the Zhou, is itself divided into two periods known as the Spring and Autumn and Warring States period. But the three dynasties actually takes you all the way from the Jia up until the emergence of the Qin in 221 BC. So I'm going to be using these terms, and that gives you a kind of general reference as to where we are in Chinese history. All right, so the first thing to say about China is that it was a tribal society. Every society in the world has gone through a tribal stage, and in China, the earliest form of social organization was the agnatic lineage, exactly like the Nuer, exactly like the Germanic tribes that would overrun Europe, exactly like the Indians actually have some matrilineal tribes, but by and large, most Indian tribes were also collections of agnates. If you remember from last week, agnatic organization means that descent is traced exclusively through males, as is inheritance. So women leave their birth families and marry into the family of their husband, and they gain status by not actually by virtue of being married, but by producing a male offspring. And because the descent is unilineal, the society divides into clearly segmented lineages, and these lineages are corporate entities. In China, the lineage will own property, meaning that each member of the lineage will own some private property, but the lineage itself, that traces their ancestry back 3 or 4 or 5 generations, will also own corporate property, usually in the form of an ancestral temple with the tablets that honor the founding ancestor of that particular unit. In China, one of the things when you had very low life expectancies, it's extremely hard to produce a male heir. And so one of the things that all of these societies do is come up with what are called strategies of heirship to produce a male heir. And that involves sometimes divorce, but in the Chinese case, concubinage and multiple wives. And so if you've seen a Chinese movie like Raise the Red Lantern, where this rich guy's got 4 wives, part of that is a means to make sure that especially wealthy, powerful people have a male heir that then, and it's not simply a matter of property, passing property down, but it's also the rope of descent, because your descendants are required to worship you. And if you don't produce descendants and there's no one to worship you, then your spirit in the afterlife is not going to be a happy one. And so the initial form of Chinese organization is completely tribal, just as much as the Nuer or the tribes in Papua New Guinea or the Solomon Islands. The transition out of tribal society really begins in about 1200 or so with the rise of the with the replacement of the Shang dynasty with that of the Zhou. The Shang and Zhou were separate peoples. We don't really know ethnically exactly what they were, but the Zhou arrived on the scene in northern China. They conquered the Shang, and then they began what some historians have labeled China's period of feudalism. Feudalism, we could spend a whole lecture just arguing what the definition is, and I think the Marxists have muddied the waters considerably because they've got an economic definition. They basically say that feudalism is an exploitative economic relationship between a lord and a master. I think that the more proper understanding of feudalism is the one that the great French historian of European feudalism, Marc Bloch, put forward, which is that it has to do with political decentralization, that a feudal system is one in which you have decentralized sources of authority, each of which possesses certain state-like characteristics, meaning it's got its own military, it distributes justice, or it applies justice to its territory, it sets rules. And if that's the definition, then in the Western Zhou period, China was genuinely feudal. That is to say, the Zhou monarch was not a centralized ruler. He was really more the first among equals. He distributed feudal benefices or appanages or fiefs to his kinsmen. And so within the first generation, the Zhou king had already distributed about 70 different fiefs across northern China. But these were controlled, and this is an important difference from European feudalism. In European feudalism, it was not kinship-based. The lord in a European feudal society cared very much about his kin and his descendants because of the principle of primogeniture, that determined who got the property. But in European feudal society, it was not organized by kinship group. I'll explain why that was the case later, but in Europe's feudal history, kinship was not an issue, whereas it was in China. And so what is called a feudal estate or a feudal fief in Zhou China was really actually the kinsman and his relatives in a segmentary lineage that controlled a certain bit of territory. And in this period, just like in tribal societies, you didn't have clear authority. Most leaders of these feudal states, they were called states in Chinese historians refer to them as states, but you're really in this very tricky transition between a tribal society and a more hierarchical state-like society. So although they're called kings of states, really what they are is tribal chiefs, meaning that they are selected by consensus among the male relatives of the descent group, and if they don't perform well or they don't, the kinsmen don't like them, they have the perfect ability to get rid of that leader and replace it with another kinsman who will then do a better job for them. What is really notable is the dramatic reduction in the number of these independent states over the, this period. And so, who knows what this 10,000 number in the Jia dynasty refers to? There were probably, it's probably more accurate to say that these were 10,000 tribes that inhabited this part of northern China. By the beginning of the Shang dynasty, that number had dropped to 3,000. At the beginning of the Eastern Zhou, it dropped to 1,800. By the beginning of the Warring States period, you had reduced the total number of political units to only 7. And so the wars among the warring states were the 7 survivors of this winnowing process. Finally, when you get to the year 221 and the emergence of the Qin dynasty, you're down to 1 unit. Now, Europe went through a similar evolution. At the end of the Middle Ages, there were probably on the order of maybe 400 different political units in Europe as a whole, and by the time you get to World War I, you're down to about 25, and now, the EU is trying to put it all back into one, but lots of luck. And one of the big meta-historical questions is, why did that process of political reduction to a smaller number of states result in a single state in the case of China and led to a genuine multiple state system in Europe? There's a woman named Victoria Wee that's written a very interesting book on this subject. I would say it's probably some combination of social structure and geography, because in Europe the geography is just much rougher, and it's much more difficult to conquer the whole of Europe the way that the Qin emperor or the Qin king was able to conquer the other 6 warring states in that period. Okay, but let me get to the Tilly thesis, because again, this Chinese case, the emergence of the first Chinese state, is a beautiful textbook example of war-driving state formation in several respects. First of all, military organization. In the Western Zhou period, warfare was exclusively the province of aristocrats who largely rode on chariots that were extremely expensive to equip, required a lot of training in order to manipulate, and war had a kind of formalistic character to it where, in a sense, they'd be tests of chivalric, honor, and a lot of times you'd leave the battlefield without killing your enemy because you wanted to make sure that he could get home to his mother to worship, her memory at for certain ritualistic purposes. I'm sorry, I actually didn't. I mentioned this. Forgot to mention one very important point. just the quantity of wars being fought in this period. There were, in the spring and autumn period, from 770 to 481, in that period there were 1,211 recorded wars fought among these different political units. In the Warring States period, there were 468 recorded wars fought among those warring states, and in that 242-year period, only 89 years went by without there being a major war between one of these political units. The scale of warfare in China, we don't think of the Chinese as being particularly militaristic, but in this period it was unbelievable, the degree of mobilization, and the scale of it was enormous. The Chinese population was already very substantially larger than that of the Roman Empire or the Roman Republic that was contemporaneous, but they talk about mobilizing as many as 500,000 soldiers for a single battle. The Livy says that the Romans lost 50,000 soldiers at Lake Trasimene and at Cannae, which everybody regards as a gross exaggeration. But Chinese historians claim that there were certain battles fought in the 3rd century BC in which as many as 250 or even 400,000 soldiers were killed. So if you discount for historical exaggeration and divide by 10, you still have extremely large battles being fought by these Chinese states in this period. And one of the things that happens when you're under the pressure of intense warfare is that the military structure changes. And so the Chinese made a transition that in Europe, in Europe you had a transition from mounted heavy knights to infantry deploying longbows and pikes that then required the mobilization of large numbers of peasants. And in China, this really happened at the end of the spring and autumn period when individual states started running out of aristocrats, basically, because you'd had all of this fighting. The fighting was done by aristocrats, and they were simply killing each other off. And you also had changes in technology that allowed you to deploy large infantry armies. And this is the point at which Chinese states then began mobilizing masses of peasantry. And to the extent that anyone can quantify this, they seem to have mobilized larger percentages of their agrarian populations than did the Romans in a comparable period. So they would mobilize 7 to 8% of the total manpower, whereas the Roman Republic never got much beyond 1 or 2% of the total population. So you bring about a social change because you've actually now mobilized a much larger part of your population, which then requires you to create a military organization. It is much more difficult to organize the logistics train for a mobilized large peasant army consisting of hundreds of thousands of soldiers compared to these old aristocrats just riding on their chariots. So what does this do? It leads to growth of taxation. The first land surveys, cadastral surveys, were done by the state of Lu in about the 4th century. You had cadastral surveys that then imposed a uniform agricultural tax on all of the landowners in particular states. The requirement for taxation then drove the requirement for a bureaucracy. The first bureaucracies were military bureaucracies for understandable reasons, but as the need for revenues increased, you then had a strong demand for a civilian bureaucracy that could manage the process of tax collection, fiscal accounts. So this is the first finance ministry and treasuries, these sorts of institutions. You had a lot of technological innovation at that point that probably drove a certain degree of state formation because it gave states much larger surpluses that they could play with. The transition from bronze to iron, improved agricultural productivity, all gave states more resources, more surplus to play with. And finally, ideas. One thing that's really fascinating is that all the great classics of Chinese thought were written really in the kind of after the spring and autumn period. So this is the period of Confucius, the spring and autumn annals, the book of history, the book of odes, book of poetry, all really concern the conflict and the deterioration of Zhou feudal society in this period. Confucius himself is reputed to be the author of the Spring and Autumn Annals, which is an account of the moral deterioration of this tribal feudal society and its replacement with this much more modern, in many ways, form of political organization. Now, the real driver of this, the Prussia of China was the state of Qin. You know, the word China comes from the state of Qin because that was the state, that was one of the 7 warring states that, that actually ended up victorious. This is a map of China. By the way, this is all just northern China, and so, you know, the Yangtze Valley, Sichuan, the whole area down through Canton and Hong Kong did not play. These were inhabited by different indigenous tribes and simply didn't enter into Chinese history at this point. But the 7 states were these states like Wei, Lu, Zhao, Qin, which is the far western state at the left side of the map, Yan, and so forth. I don't know. They seem not to have permitted states to have more than 1-syllable names in this period. I don't really quite understand why, but there you have it. The single most important of these was the state of Qin in the far west. It probably benefited from its position as a frontier state because they had to deal with the Xiongnu and other pastoral nomads, so that they were constantly, you know, mobilized for that kind of warfare, but they also, in a certain sense, had a protected rear and could develop their own institutions, a little bit insulated from the fights that were going on further to the east. The state of Qin actually really is the one that pioneers all the modern institutions, and it comes under a fellow named Shang Yang, who was an itinerant minister. He was actually born in the state of Wei, but he was hired by Duke Zhao of Qin to be his chief minister. James Scott has this book called Seeing Like a State, in which he says that all states have the same characteristic. They want to make their societies legible, because he realized that as long as you're based on lineages and tribal organization, you're never going to centralize power. So he basically dispossessed all of the feudal aristocrats. He created a uniform set of laws and punishments, and he abolished the so-called well-field system. This is basically a form of land reform. One of the best markers of the power of a state is whether they are actually able to engage in serious land reform and dispossess traditional landowners, and the state of Qin did this. Well, I am really running late here. We haven't even gotten to India. Okay, I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. Sorry, I haven't been keeping track of time. All right, so, you know, let me collapse the Chinese story very, very simply. State of Qin develops these extremely powerful modern institutions, and by modern, I mean modern in Max Weber's sense. Weber defined certain characteristics that were possessed by the Prussian or German bureaucracy of his day, which had to do with things like, you know, bureaucrats are subject to the authority of the defined state. They're organized into a hierarchy. Offices are filled by free contract. Each office has a specific functional specialty. The officials are subject to strict discipline and control. Promotion is done on a merit basis. You're remunerated by fixed salaries. Every single one of these Weberian criteria for a modern state was fulfilled by the Qin state and then by the state that they created after the unification of China. One of the big mysteries in the interpretation of Chinese history is why people in the West never gave credit to China for having done this. Max Weber himself continued to talk. He knew a lot about China. He wrote a whole book on China, kept talking about China as a patrimonial state, but it actually was not. They actually invented a kind of modern bureaucracy that really did not exist in the West for almost 2 millennia after that. And I think part of the reason is that the political modernity was not accompanied by an economic modernity, and the assumption is that if you have modern political institutions, well, of course you're going to have capitalism and growth and all of this other stuff, and I think what this simply shows is that institutions aren't enough to produce the modern world. You need a lot of other things: science and technology, universities, a different, more accumulative ethic, and the like. All right, let me move on. I really hate to do this, to give such short shrift to India, because it's actually much more complicated than China. So let me pose the following comparison, because this stuff is really only interesting when you do this in a comparative light. After the Qin dynasty goes away, it's replaced within a generation by the Han dynasty, which lasts for 400 years. It's the dynasty that defines Chinese civilization. And from then, from the beginning of the Han up until the 19th century when it's conquered, when China is occupied by foreign powers, the default condition of China is to be a centralized, unified state. The dynasties are separated by periods, interregnums of chaos when the country falls apart, but it always comes back together. And so in that entire period, the typical condition is to be a centralized, powerful state. India's history is exactly the opposite. Its default situation is to be a decentralized, relatively weak, unconcentrated collection of principalities, kingdoms, and so forth, punctuated by a couple of big empires, but even these empires were never as powerful as the ones achieved in China. So you had Ashoka's empire, the Mauryan Empire, that was pretty much coterminous with the Qin Empire in China, about the 3rd century BC. It's indicative of something about Indian society that even the memory of this empire was lost because there are no written records of it, unlike the case of China. And actually, even the knowledge that you had an empire that spanned most of the northern part of the subcontinent all the way down into the Deccan was actually lost in Indian historical memory until some British Orientalist was able to decipher these rock edicts of Ashoka, and then they realized that he actually had put together this extremely impressive empire. But it only lasted a couple of hundred years, and then it fell apart, and then you got this reduction into a bunch of squabbling, either tribal units or very small states. The second one was the Gupta Empire about 400 or 500 years later. But again, the Gupta Empire never unified more than, let's say, 2/3 of the subcontinent, even less than that. They only were able to do this in northern India, and southern India largely was outside of the control of any of these political authorities. The weakness in the Indian inability to create a powerful centralized form of authority then left them vulnerable to foreign conquest, and this begins with the Ghaznavid invasion of the Muslims at the beginning of the second millennium, and then, of course, with the British. All right, so the question is, India is a tribal society at the beginning. The Indo-Aryans that settled the Gangetic Plain are organized just the same way that Chinese tribal groups were organized. Same form of structure, same tendency to fissure, and so forth. And so why is it that in India you don't get powerful centralized states, and in China you do? Well, one answer, possible answer, is that the Indians never went through a prolonged period of military conflict the way the Chinese did. In a way, that begs the question, however, as to why this conflict never emerged, or why you didn't have the equivalent of the Warring States period in India. But I think that the far more important issue was the question of religion and religious ideology, which I think completely threw the Indian path of development off onto an extremely different kind of track, which I call the Indian detour, because what I'm trying to do is, this book is, if China is a paradigm, then you then have to explain why states did not resemble China in their political development. The detour in India's case really arises with the creation of a Brahmanic religion towards the end of the second millennium BC. This Brahmanic religion, first of all, creates a fourfold system of varnas. You have the Brahmins at the top, the Kshatriyas, or the warriors. Second, you have Vaishyas, or merchants, as third, and then Shudras, which is basically everybody else, peasants, farmers, the people that do the actual work in the society, as the lowest of these three broad social classes. And what's really interesting and really different from China is that the Brahmins place themselves at the top of the warriors, so that they have a higher social status than the people who actually wield military force in Indian society. Now, there is a big argument that Weber and Marx and a lot of other great thinkers have engaged in as to whether ideas or material interests are the real drivers of history. So Marx is famous for saying that religion is the opiate of the masses, that religion is a kind of fairy tale that the powerful people in the society think up in order to convince people that they've got a right to exploit them, essentially. And, Weber and Durkheim and a lot of 19th century sociologists said, no, it's just the opposite. It's the ideas that are primary. The ideas are the ones that create social classes in the first place, and you can't explain development without reference to these ideas. Now, if you wanted a case of a group making up a fairy tale to justify their domination of the society, I think the Brahmins do a pretty good job, with all due respect to that. I'm going to explain exactly what I mean by that. But if you think about this from an external point of view, the Brahmins place themselves at the top of this fourfold hierarchy, which means that every act from the humblest wedding ceremony or funeral all the way up to the investiture of a king requires a Brahmin priest to preside over it, and the legitimacy of any Indian monarch depends entirely on their being able to get the assent of the local Brahmin or the Brahmin in the king's court to go along with it. And so, in a sense, you can say, well, this was a religion that was made up to justify the social, awarding, the Brahmins were therefore awarding themselves this high social status and then making up this fairy tale to justify it. That's one way of interpreting history. But I think that even though that may be an ex post way of understanding Indian religion, that's looking at it only from the inside, from the outside. From the outside, many of the aspects of the Brahmanic religion seem very strange. The prohibition on eating cows, the concern with ritual pollution, and so forth. But if you look at Brahmanic religion from the inside, that is to say, if you take seriously the metaphysical principles upon which the religion is based, it is an extremely rational set of ideas. And I think part of the reason that to this day, young Westerners are drawn to ashrams in India is that, there's a kind of brilliance to this religion that you can only perceive if you see it from the inside and you begin to accept some of its basic principles. And so, in some sense, what the religion does is the starting principle is the presumption that the entire phenomenal world is in some sense unreal, that everything we see around us, and particularly our material and biological circumstances in which we live, are not the ultimate reality, that there is a realm of the spirit that is far purer than anything we see in day-to-day life. And in some sense, the purpose of the religious voyage that one begins not in just one lifetime but over successive lifetimes is an effort to get away from the material conditions in which human beings were born. There's one analyst of Indian religion that puts it this way: the blood and gore associated with birth, the suffering and deformations associated with disease and violence, the repugnancies associated with waste effusions from the human body, and the decay and purification associated with death are all associated with mortal life and hence need to be transcended. And every characteristic of Indian social structure, beginning with the caste system, can be understood in terms of that need to avoid ritual pollution on the assumption that our material biological lives are not actually, the true reality. And therefore, the entire structure of caste is based on the need to move as far as possible in higher castes away from sources of ritual pollution. So therefore, tanners, undertakers, people that deal with dead animals are at the lowest part of the hierarchy, and those that don't have to deal with these biological realities are at the top of it. If you ask why Brahmins are vegetarians, well, if you think about it, what does it mean to eat meat? You're eating a corpse, right? So think about that the next time you eat a cheeseburger. And so, in some sense, again, if you accept the metaphysical grounds of Indian religion, the entire social structure that emerges with all of the hierarchical organization of Indian society into castes makes actually perfect sense. And this then leads to extremely different conditions under which you try to form a state, because you are now forming a state in a society in which the people that deploy military force do not have a monopoly of legitimation. In China, the emperor worships his own ancestors, and he controls the priests that preside over the rituals. In Indian society, the ruler or the king does not control that. He has to rely on a class of Brahmins. Indian society at village level is completely, in a sense, self-sufficient, because what the caste system does is it sacralizes the occupational order. It takes the principle of endogamy that exists in a lineage society and applies it to occupations like potter, weaver, tanner, dancer, and so forth, and means that you can only, it defines the boundaries of clan exogamy and says you cannot marry outside of those occupational castes, but it creates a very interdependent and actually workable system at a village level by which Indian society can govern itself. And so if you think about why were Indian polities never able to generate the kind of striking power that Chinese polities were, it very much has to do with this complex social structure that is created out of this particular set of religious ideas. Just think about armies. Armies, first of all, are run by kshatriyas, which is one of the four classes, but the other classes in the fourfold system of varnas do not participate in military activity. So something like Shang Yang's mobilization of the entire peasant population was something that was extremely difficult to achieve in any Indian society. You think about the prohibitions regarding blood and waste effusions. You know, battlefields are, hate to tell you, they've got a lot of blood in them, and if for ritual purposes you can't deal with a corpse or you can't deal with blood, it's going to limit very severely the number of people you can mobilize as soldiers. And, there's a number of other issues. One important, really important issue has to do with literacy. It is really interesting the degree of documentation that exists in India versus China. In China, going all the way back to the Shang and even the Jia dynasties, you have extensive written records of government interactions. In the Shang dynasty, you had a lot of oracle bones that were the shoulder bones of sheep in which bureaucrats would write their transactions, that we collected X number of taxes and sent them to, Lord so-and-so. There's virtually nothing like this that comes out of the comparable period of Indian history. And the reason for that was the Brahmins, first of all, maintained an oral tradition over the Vedic text. The Vedic texts were not written down until really kind of the end of the first millennium BC, in a sense that preserved the monopoly that the Brahmins exercised over ritual, because they had to then memorize all of the texts, and their children, their sons would then repeat the memorized texts, and it reinforced a segmentation of literary knowledge to a very narrow class of people. And even in later periods of Indian history, you don't get anything remotely like the extensive dynastic histories that you get in the case of China. And you think about running a large empire the size of the subcontinent, where bureaucrats do not have the ability to communicate through written language, all of their routine decisions. It just creates enormous, simple problems of public administration. So there's a number of other reasons, I think, why it's just been hard for any political order to really penetrate Indian society, given this kind of religiously legitimated social structure. So let me just conclude a little bit by talking about contemporary China and India, because I actually think that this early history tells you a lot about these two societies today. As we all know, China is a authoritarian regime, and India has been a democracy since its founding in the 1940s. And a lot of people say, they say a number of things. They say, first of all, that the fact that one's authoritarian and one is democratic is a reflection of things that happened recently, of the colonial past. So obviously the British transmitted a lot of institutions to India, including the idea of democracy, a secular state, and all of that sort of thing. Or communism, created the grounds for the current dictatorship and the like. People also, when they're comparing China and India, sometimes admire the Chinese ability to make decisions. So if the Chinese want to build an airport, they just basically plow over all the, little homesteads that are in the way of the runways and move the people somewhere else. In India, the whole community organizes, they complain, they protest, they vote, for their member of parliament, and then, the political system then prevents the government from putting in this big infrastructure project. So where does all of this ultimately come from? And I would say that the deep root of this is really not the colonial experience. The colonial experience obviously gave both of, or the colonial or the 20th century experience of both of these societies gave certain specific institutions to both countries. But if you look at this longer pattern of history, I don't think it's any accident that China is an authoritarian state today and that India is a democracy. India is not a democracy in the sense that Amartya Sen seems to think that there are deep precedents for democracy in India, but there are no precedents for authoritarian government in India. There really are no precedents for it. Anyone that has tried to create a powerful, centralized regime that's capable of really penetrating Indian society has failed, all the way back to the days of Ashoka. And so it is inconceivable that India could be ruled by a totalitarian regime of the sort that overtook China in the Maoist period. And conversely, the fact that you've got strong centralized government in China also should be no surprise, because what you lack in Chinese history is any tradition of rule of law that would limit the discretion of the sovereign authority in China, and you don't really have organized social groups like a landed aristocracy, an organized peasantry, independent commercial cities, all of which, in the case of European political development, were critical counterweights to the centralized power of the state. And therefore, in a sense, you become path dependent, because once you get this powerful state going, the state can then suppress the organization of new forms of opposition to its rule. So just as the Chinese suppressed various religiously based peasant uprisings in the Han Dynasty, so they're suppressing Falun Gong today. Now, we're not at the end of this lecture series, so I don't think that we're all stuck in these 2 millennia old historical patterns, but I do think that it suggests that some of the roots of contemporary political behavior actually are much more deeply rooted than simply 20th century history. So I'm sorry, we never got to the other civilizations, but we'll have to try to do that maybe in the next lecture. Thank you very much. So you're free to get up and go, and anyone that wants to stay and ask a question is welcome to. Roger.
This is a little bit discouraging when you think about modern political development.
Why don't you stand?
Why don't you take the mic?
I was saying that sounds a little bit discouraging if you're thinking about modern political development, because based on what you just finished saying, there's a certain element of predestination and inevitability the way societies develop. And if that's true, how can we influence the future direction of development if it's all preordained?
Well, okay, I never used the word preordained. I just said that there are certain long-term patterns, historical patterns, and if you don't take account of them, you're really not going to understand where any of this comes from. But this is something I'm going to try to elaborate further in the last lecture. When you get out of the Malthusian world that you're living in here, and you enter, past the Industrial Revolution, when you enter into a period in human history where you have possibilities for continuous economic growth, then a lot of these considerations begin to change, because, among other things, it creates a much more fluid social environment. You have middle class, you have other actors that can get rich outside of the purview of the state. And I think that to the extent that there's a hope that you're going to get democracy in a country like China, and I believe that that is entirely possible, in my lifetime. We'll see how long I live, but I think it's entirely possible. It's going to be because in a modern globalized capitalist economy, the state simply cannot snuff out all of its competitors, and that from the bottom, you get a lot of organization of new social actors that simply would not have existed in any of these earlier historical periods. Now, there's an Indian counterpart to that is, will there ever be an Indian state that is sufficiently powerful to really, break the caste system or, change some of these deeply rooted social practices? I kind of doubt it, but on the other hand, in India as well, you have the same phenomenon. You have a middle class, you have entrepreneurs, you have the growth of a modern economy that bubbles up, parallel to these old institutions, and that again changes the whole complexion. Plus globalization, plus all of the external influences and ideas that come in. So I don't think it's quite as pessimistic as you might think. Yeah, David.
Okay, you said that China is this perfect example of Charles Tilley's theory of the state making war, and that sounds frightfully plausible and so forth. But Charles Tilley also argues in that book that, he's got that full cartoon panel version of how history folds out, and it starts with a king wearing armor, it ends up with the prime minister or president wearing a suit and worrying about the voters. And that, he argued, provided one of the other pillars which you referred to of accountability. Now, if China is such a perfect example of the first part of the Tilley thesis, why doesn't it develop this accountability, which Tilley also said happened in Europe?
Well, unfortunately, you're going to have to wait around for lecture 4, which is all about accountability. But a short version of that is as follows. The modernization process involves state building, which is to say the concentration of state power, centralized state power, and accountability arises because other political actors are able to organize themselves in a sufficiently cohesive way that they can prevent the state from undermining them. And where you get accountable government is where one of those actors, like Parliament, becomes so powerful that they can actually force the king to back down, right? And that's really what's never happened in China. In this historical period, the big difference, I think, between China and Europe was the aristocracy, because in Europe you had a very powerful landed aristocracy that resisted state centralization, and in China, for a variety of reasons, their aristocratic class was much more dispersed, weaker, didn't have its own military forces, and therefore could never force any Chinese monarch to accept any degree of real accountability. So I think that's a kind of nutshell. Cinnamon.
Frank, thank you very much. That was brilliant and really, really provocative. You talked about the role of religion in the state, and you talked about the Prophet Muhammad, and kind of intimated the role of religion, and you just touched on it in India with the Brahmin class. I wonder if you could just delve a little bit more deeply into the role of the religion and the state, and how that shaped the theory and thinking about the state.
Again, the next lecture, which will be in 2 weeks, is about the rule of law. And the story of the rise of the rule of law is entirely a story about religion, because in my view, you don't get genuine rule of law except out of religious sources. And so for that reason, the Christian West, the Muslim world, and India all have something that identifiably look like the rule of law, but China has never had it, because China, really never had religion in the sense that any of those other civilizations did. I mean, they had ancestor worship, and then in Chinese history, most religion is kind of protest religion. So you get Buddhism and Taoism, and a lot of times these are ways of mobilizing peasants or, people that are not in the elite, and organizing them against the state, and then the state beats them back, and the Confucians kind of end up on top again. And for that reason, you never had a separate class of priests that were the guardians of law. So that's one important way that religion, impacts political institutions. But essentially, religion solves this problem that the rational choice people can never really quite explain. Is that why do these rational actors decide to cooperate with one another at certain circles of cooperation. And I think what religion does is it provides people a basis for cooperating that goes beyond their material interests. And so, as I said, you can see this very clearly with the rise of a powerful Arab state in place of Arab tribalism once you have the introduction of Islam. Yes?
The comparisons between warring states China and early modern Europe, they seem to be a lot of natural analogies. I'm not a classicist, but is there anything to be gained looking at classical era European state formation, or is that they're just less fruitful?
I'm sorry, which period of?
Well, Roman Republic or Greek city-states, or any of those earlier periods of European Mediterranean basin state formation in comparison to China.
Yeah, I mean, this book has taken a lot of work, and if I had more energy, maybe I could have, put in a few chapters on that as well. It just seems to me that that whole period has been covered rather well in Western historiography, and I don't think that you're going to find a terribly different story, about the relationship of military conflict and the emergence of these higher forms of political organization. It's just that I didn't pick Rome in particular because I just think that in many ways the Romans actually never achieved a very, they were successful in the sense that they cobbled together this big empire, but they never created anything remotely like what the Chinese did, which was a centralized bureaucracy that could actually penetrate society. In fact, the Romans didn't even offer citizenship to everybody that lived on the Italian peninsula. The social wars were all because other people wanted to be Roman citizens and they wouldn't let them. And so, the real core of Rome was actually a very small political unit, despite its, its long-term reach. So.
Well, thank you for a wonderful lecture. I think it's great that you've looked into the ideological sphere in addition to the materialist one, because a lot of people read books like Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, and you're left wondering why not India, and it doesn't really have a good explanation. My question is, if you compare India and Christian Europe, you have also a clergy and a priestly class.
Yeah.
And you also have many different ethnic groups that are in divisions that are difficult to put together, yet Europe does, the different states do go out and conquer. And I was just wondering why you think that is. Is it because maybe one group is able to incorporate conquered peoples into the religious ethnic group and the other isn't? Or is it reproductive restrictions on the priesthood, or
So I'm sorry, the question is, why is Europe more successful or less successful than India?
More successful at imperialist expansion.
Yeah. I would say that there are probably a lot of specific reasons that are rooted in it's rooted in geography and in some of the details of religion. So that, for example, I don't think that Christianity ever quite stood in the way of the penetration of European states into their society. Well, okay, actually, let's back up. Part of the lecture I didn't get into was why did tribalism disappear in Europe at such an early date? And the basic answer to that is the Catholic Church. I mean, it's really the Catholic Church that on a social level killed Catholicism, already by the 7th, 8th centuries, this was all disappearing. And so to the extent that kinship was an obstacle to the consolidation of state power, that just wasn't a problem in Europe the way it was in China, in India, and so forth. And then I think religion was organized on a different institutional basis where you had a one centralized religious institution that could act powerfully to limit in certain ways the power of European monarchs, but it could also, as an institution, collaborate with that same monarch and achieve, therefore, a higher level collective action that I think these Indian polities were simply never able to, to achieve. I mean, for example, there's just nothing like the equivalent, there's no Indian pope, that can give his blessing to the Holy Roman Empire if he chooses to do so, because it's a much more decentralized system.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I really admire your intellectual courage to deal with this kind of big, vast issues you usually have done, and then other academics would feel queasy to deal with.
Yeah, well, a lot of them don't have tenure, so.
As an economist who has been working on development, I don't have that much knowledge about politics and other deep issues. I'm just curious that while you are comparing between China and India, in India, why the Indian Brahminic religion was not really affected by anything else, like in your example, Ashoka was actually adopting the Buddhism, which came out of the Brahminic religion, but which really pervaded. But why they were not, they didn't have a chance to really be affected by that. And in China, while you are talking about a lack of religion, but in Chinese dynasties, every dynasty needed some political legitimacy. And even in transition from Qin dynasty to Han dynasty, Han dynasty had to choose the Confucianism from legalism you are talking about, which was really basis of the Qin dynasty. So in some sense, in my view, that the it seems to be a little bit unfair to say Chinese didn't have a really religion. They had a sort of heavenly. I'm not a Chinese, so they had a sort of always the kings and emperors needed a sort of legitimacy as a heavenly will, which was a basis of the Confucianism and other things. So I'm just curious about those views.
All of that. Those are good questions, and there's actually a good answer, I think, to all of them. First of all, it has to do with, well, let's just begin with definition of terms. Confucianism is not a religion. It's a secular ideology. It does not refer to a transcendental being or a spiritual world, and so forth. It's a set of ideas. When I say that China never had religion, it did have ancestor worship. And as I said, it did have Taoism and Buddhism, but those entered into Chinese society not from the top. I mean, there were emperors that were Buddhists, but by and large, those were protest religions of people that were not in power, that wanted some source of unity and identity and so forth. But the more important thing was an institutional one, which is that religion, China, right from the beginning, was what Weber called Caesaro-Papist, meaning that the emperor was the one that had the power to appoint the priests. In Europe, in India, and in the Middle East, the secular ruler did not have that power. That religion was under the custody of a separate class of priests who appointed themselves. They had their own form of legitimation. They did not need political power to get ahead. In the Eastern Church, this then got united, and the Eastern Church became Caesaro-Papist. But in those other societies, you always had a separate ulama or Catholic Church or Brahmin class that was not simply under the heels of the religious authority, and therefore were in a much better position to resist that political authority's effort to centralize political power. And I think that's really why China is different.
Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. I'm a little bit surprised by your comments on the classical world, specifically on Roman history, because I understand that it's difficult to make these very broad comparisons between China and the classical world. But it seems to me that in the formation of the Roman state, there are many essential elements of the modern state. For instance, if you consider the fact that the Roman Republic was a republic, a res publica, a commonwealth, I think that going back to the classical world, we find first this presence of representative institutions, which probably also in the sophisticated world of Qing and Han Dynasty China were not existing. And in addition to that, I think that the contribution of the state formation of Rome was the concept of a law, the Roman law,
yeah.
which is really an essential element of differentiation with China. And I think that is still a very, very important factor between nowadays China and the Western world. Thank
Look,
you.
again, this is it's a confusion I think that's created in a way by the piecemeal way these ideas are coming out. But the China-India part of my book is about state formation and state building. And then there's another part of the book which has to do with the emergence of law and the rule of law. And there's a third part that has to do with the emergence of accountable government. So you're right, Greek city-states and the Roman Republic had elements 2 and 3. They had rule of law and they had some form of political accountability. But in this question of who had the modern state first, there's no question in my mind that the kind of centralized public administration that the Chinese created was much more impressive than anything that was done either by the Greeks or the Romans. Now, as I said, if you only have one without 2 and 3, you get a great dictatorship. And, you know, and for that reason, I would never say that the Chinese figured it all out. They missed 2/3 of the modern, you know, political solution. And that's still their problem today, right? And the Romans and the Greeks had, you know, parts of elements 2 and 3, but not so much part 1. And in fact, as we'll see in Latin America, I think that's exactly the problem, is that if you get too much rule of law and too much accountability and a weak state, you also have a kind of funny, you know, political order as well. But that's, you know, that's the way I would respond to that. So yeah, it's not that I'm not giving credit to those societies, but we're just in the part about state formation right now. But we'll return to the Romans because they are extremely important in the formation of European civil law as you get into a later historical period. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You mentioned the Prophet Muhammad as an example of a political leader who was able to use religious charisma and also end or partially end loyalties, kinship loyalties among tribes. But would you call Medina a city-state?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I've actually got a few pages in my book asking when did Arab society actually make the transition into something that you could call a state. And it's a very complicated answer because even under the Prophet Muhammad, it was actually a lot more like a tribal federation that was simply kept together by his authority. And then the moment that he died, all those tribal rivalries reappeared. And in some sense, the whole Sunni-Shia split is a split between the Hashemites and the Umayyads, who are two lineages of the same tribe that had been contesting for power in the Medina period. And you know, the place kind of fell apart. I actually have to give another lecture at 2, so maybe with that, thank you very much for your attention.